Hey guys, how are you? Stas here. I'm here with Dermot in the Beerco headquarters in the warehouse, as you can see.
Beerco HQ. Welcome back, Stas. It's been a while, my friend.
Yeah, thanks. Just swinging by on my way up to the Yarra Valley.
Sunny Warburton.
Yeah, so I thought I'd call in and say good day, pick up some grain and some yeast and hops.
Yeah.
And we were just having a chat about some questions that you were getting.
Frequently asked questions here at Beerco, Stas, and we're really appreciative of everyone who's given thumbs up and comments on these great videos that Andrew's doing for us. And we're really interested in trying to make them as informative and useful to you guys as possible. So one of the questions that came up this week from a wonderful customer was, I think I've got a stalled fermentation. How do I unstuck it? Is this yeast prone to stalling? And it was a yeast that we've used before and it never stalled on us. So I've been out asking the pros and we've been doing our reading. And we think the first thing to do too, team, is to read from authoritative sources like Beer and Brewing magazine or Brew Your Own magazine. It's tempting just to shout it out to the crowd on Facebook, but sometimes there's people out there who are going to give you some advice that could be conflicting or not necessarily always accurate.
And the old adage of if you ask 20 homebrewers an answer for a question, you'll get 30 answers.
Certainly can. And I've certainly had about at least 5 or 6 answers. We were just talking before when we were at the kegerator there, Stas, that the first thing you've got to check, is it actually stalled?
That's right.
So, or is it just you've got a leaky fermenter? So
So number one, and you see a lot of people, don't judge fermentation activity based on your airlock, because you could have a leak somewhere in your seal, or just the little grommet around the air seal could be just slowly leaking gas, but you'll still have active fermentation. First thing you need to do is just take a hydrometer reading and make sure that the numbers stopped, and not just one. Don't just say, oh, I'm expecting it to finish at such and such a gravity. Take it in like 2 successive days. If it has stopped between those 2 days, or it's the same reading, that's when it's stalled. Make sure that you have got a stuck fermentation.
Yes.
There's a few things that we could that could cause it. Number one is probably a little bit less common if you're using a saison yeast. Some of those strains are CO2 back pressure sensitive. I haven't been using an airlock for over 12 months.
No.
I've just been putting a bit of foil over the top. So
a lot of people do that, or a blow off tube sometimes.
But I just don't want any back pressure.
Fair enough. And I think I've talked to some of the pros up the road like Brenton and that, and they would sort of advise not to spund until later in the fermentation. Chris White did a good presentation at ANHC6 on fermentation under pressure, and if you put pressure on your fermentation early, and it will cause some of the, it might suppress some esters, but it'll cause some things to spike. The other one is, are you brewing a lager? So that's a common one too. We had one of our customers saying, I can't see the massive krausen I'm used to on my ales and my IPAs. If it's a lager, it's a bottom fermenting yeast, you don't necessarily need to set. So look for signs of, I guess, small bubbles rising. Let's say you don't need to be too precious about as the bubbles coming through the airlock. Prior to the fermentation, of course, is the mash. And we may have had that issue here with one of the beers that we made and threw under the stairs in the cool winter months with a ESB yeast, and it stalled, but it could have been that we weren't taking accurate readings throughout the mash and we missed our mash temp.
Because you can, if you miss your mash temps and you maybe mashing a little bit high, you get a more unfermentable. So those numbers that you're expecting to get down to you for your terminal or final gravity, you might actually, be done, but you've just mismanaged your mash temperatures at the start. So. And then I guess the next one is, if you have reached terminal gravity, here's where the debate comes: do I rouse the yeast? So giving it a good stir and all that sort of thing, like we were just discussing before, Andrew, is fine to introduce oxygen at the start of a primary fermentation. But if we're already into the secondary fermentation, or the fermentation is complete, maybe you have got a lot of dextrins in your beer, we don't necessarily want to be introducing oxygen. So one of the ways you can do it is to take some beer out of your fermenter, if you've got a tap on it, and then do a simple test. Do you want to explain that? I can't remember what the actual name is, but basically you want to test if there are fermentables in there. You're not worried about the quality of fermentation. You take out 100 ml, 200 ml sample. Sorry about the camera shaking.
And you just want to throw some yeast at it. It could be bread yeast, it could be any sort of yeast. You just sort of throw it in, leave it at room temperature, and see if fermentation happens.
Yeah.
If it does, then you've got fermentables still in the beer, and you want to try and either make a starter of the yeast that you used, or introduce something else, and then you've got another issue. It could be that your yeast is flocculated too early, or the temperature's too low, so you might want to gently raise the temperature up.
And that's one of the tips in the articles. We'll put the articles under the show notes. One is to raise it a couple of points. And then the other one too, you can do, if you want to do, it's almost like a fast fermentation. If you take some out and you've got a stir plate and a flask handy, do what Andrew's suggesting, put some yeast in there, put it on the stir plate.
So take a gravity reading first, because you might not see the... Just see if there's a change in your FG.
And then leave it for 24 to 48 hours, and that will effectively ferment. And a lot of professional brewers will do that. They'll, at the start of fermentation, take a couple of litres, put it on a stir plate and a flask, leave it in a warm area, like in the lab or the boardroom or wherever, and that will give them, within a couple of days, their terminal gravity. So that will help as well.
Yeah, because you're not interested in the quality of fermentation.
No.
If you've got all these esters and stuff popping out, that you just don't worry in terms of how fermentable is my wort. So
I'm just going to go quickly as we wrap up. 6 tools to unstuck your fermentation. Make sure your fermentation is really has already really stalled. So hence what Andrew was saying. Let's take a couple of readings. Heat things up a couple of points. That way at least you're not introducing oxygen. The third one here is add more yeast, which we've discussed, and to get better results, do a method called krausening, which is making a starter off to the side. So so I think that's better than actively rousing the beer in fermentation. And of course you can try more tolerant yeasts. So some people do hit it with champagne yeast. We tend to go for your classic ale strains, or sometimes a lager strain. And I guess the joking last one is, if you don't mind sour beer, you can just inoculate it with Brett, lacto, or a mixed culture, or chuck it in a carboy or a demijohn, and under the stairs or in the back shed for 2 or 3 years, and they will eat the dextrins. But
if I guess the other thing is, a lot of people probably don't want to hang on to a beer for that long if they're not sure about it.
No, that's true.
If you're kegging, you can just chuck it in a keg, gas it up, and enjoy, and it'll be probably a little bit sweet, and or not as higher alcohol.
Yes.
Don't bottle it though, because you don't want bottle bombs.
No, and that's what we tried actually. We put a stalled coffee porter into a kegerator with a spunding valve with some T58 conditioning yeast, and that way we thought, well look, if we're bottling it too early, but we didn't want to leave it under the stairs in a fermenter with a lot of oxygen in there, and the beer turned out fine. We think it was probably an issue with mash temps, which could be an issue, topic for another video. But on that point too, Andrew, before we wrap up, we're really interested to address the topics that interest you, our watchers, readers and listeners. And so please shoot some questions to us at feedback@beerco.com.au, or write them under this video, and we'll work out a method with Gus, our Chief Technology Officer, on how to vote up and down questions so that we can make these videos as informative and practical and helpful for you to brew better and brew happy.
Cool.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for coming in. Have fun in Warburton, and have a great brewing weekend.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks, Dermot.